Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
Well, you definitely have to be there to contribute to the next conversation that I want to have with you, because regular listeners to this programme will know that I have been worrying about this for a very long time, largely because of you. I usually share the same examples with you to highlight the early alarm bells we received about the upward spread, I would call it, of economic insecurity. So if we were going to do it in percentage terms, and we were going to ask the population who would genuinely describe themselves as, and this is important words, who would genuinely describe themselves as chronically broke. Chronically broke. What percentage of society do you think would describe themselves as chronically broke? 20%? 30%? And chronically broke, that's strong. And it's a self-applied description. So it's not the Joseph Rowntree Foundation or Oxfam drawing, setting up the goalposts. You can make your own goalposts and decide whether or not you fit through them. Are you chronically broke? What do we mean by chronically broke? 70% of us think that we are chronically broke. That's the working population. So when I said, what percentage would you pick? And you said 20, 25, 30. You were including unemployed people in that, because they are generally the poorest people in the land. And the new normal is how researchers at the Royal Society of the Arts have described economic insecurity, which, this makes me want to weep, you know. Let's all be friends for a while on this one, because I've been saying for years that this was happening. And not just because of austerity, although I think that was an enormous catalyst. I've been saying for years that this was happening because you were telling me. And yet when you suggest that there is some sort of political responsibility for this, you get shouted out of public discourse with screams about, it won't be about immigration, will it, and foreign aid, or the usual nonsense. This is 70% of the country who describe themselves as being chronically broke. I remember sitting here and triple-checking my numbers when it was reported last year that 17 million people couldn't get their hands on 100 quid if they had to. And then I've also got this voice in my head saying, look, you know, of all the people listening to this programme at the moment, and we get research into what our ABC ones are and our demographics and all of that malarkey, and we do have a much younger, wealthier audience than is traditionally associated with phone-in radio. But still, you know, if 70% of us think that we're chronically broke, then I have these conversations with an air that you can hear now in my voice of shock. And I'm conscious, this is the voice in my head, is very conscious of the fact that if you're living this, my shock is going to be quite offensive to you, perhaps. Or amusing, I suppose, if you're feeling friendly. Oh, bless him. Thinking that, you know, being chronically broke was the preserve of a tiny proportion of the country. But I don't actually think that. I'm in the 30%. I live comfortably. But when I compare my financial situation to somebody of comparable status 20 years ago, I'm worse off than they are. It's a silly little example, but I'd have a little flat in Soho. I'd have a little flat in the West End if I was me 20 years ago, and identical on every other level. Partly because property's gone out of control, and partly because wage inflation hasn't kept up with real inflation. Nobody is, except at the very top of these trees, nobody is immune to these changing tides. And you know, how many times have we explained? How many times have we explained that if the money keeps going up, and we keep looking down, shouting at the unemployed, shouting at the homeless, shouting at the immigrants, shouting at this, shouting at that, then the money will keep moving up until you get a day like today, when you learn that 70% of your country's working population is chronically broke, thriving, striving, or just about surviving. This is a survey of more than 2,000 workers, which found just 30% said they lived comfortably, 40% said that they were permanently precarious, and 30% said they were not managing to get by. These are the stories that you don't want to do, aren't they? These are the stories that you just want to look away from and pretend they're not happening. 0345 6060973 is the number that you need. Thriving, striving, or just about surviving. What's it like to be in the 40% that say their finances are permanently precarious, or the 30% that said they were not managing to get by? And what we have to do if we're going to get out of this hole, which is only going to get deeper as Brexit unfolds, but what we have to start doing is removing some of the stigma from stating that you're skint. 0345 6060 973 is the number to call. And, you know, if we can remove some of the stigma from saying that we're skint, then perhaps we'll start finding the right targets to take aim at in the hope of creating an economy or a society where that level of skintness starts to reduce. So how best to do this? How best to do this? To ask you, when you tell me what you do, possibly even what you earn, will we be staggered to discover that you consider your finances to be permanently precarious? Property is at the heart of all of this. None of us have properly worked it out yet, but when you look at how much property's gone up by over the last 20 years, so roughly the period I've been a homeowner, actually, it'll be 18 years in May, if you look at that and then you look at your wages, I think that the middle class... All right, I'm going to give you a big theory. Everybody sit down. It's not my own entirely. It's an adaptation of a theory that was linked to the last global financial crisis about largely American people being given mortgages that they just couldn't afford, but no one was doing the proper checking and everyone was raking off the commissions on the mortgage deals. And the argument that I understood at the time was that part of the reason why workers weren't complaining about a lack of pay rises was because it was so easy to get credit. And if it's really easy to get credit, you almost feel better off. But in fact, of course, you're not, because you've got to pay it all back and you've got to pay interest on it in the process. So I think, and I don't know whether it was deliberate or not, I know there's a lot of conspiratorial talk about neoliberalism, but as someone who makes no bones about the fact that he's doing okay, but I don't know how long I'd have before the wheels came off. We always talk about this, don't we? How many paychecks could you afford not to receive before the wheels came off? Here's one here. Thriving, we've got 3 years, and this isn't boasting, this is just trying to help me with a... Thriving, we live within our means and we save for a rainy day, and we have 3 years' salary saved just in case. I admire you for that, but I don't think it's fair to suggest that it's simple. And you clearly can save. A lot of people listening to this program will have nothing left at the end of the month. They'll have a bit minus at the end of the month. So my theory is that the middle class have put up with this wage freeze, effectively, absence of pay rises, while the dividends paid to shareholders and the wages paid to chief executives and board level people have gone through the absolute roof. I mean, they have gone bonkers. It's not just me that says this now, finally. It's you know, everybody else is saying it as well. But the reason why people like me have not really got cross enough or concerned enough is because our property's been going up in value every year. So you might be sitting there thinking... Because, look, if 70% of people are chronically broke, that's a significant portion of them are going to be mortgage holders or homeowners, and yet they're still chronically broke. So my very amateurish theory is that the artificially inflated property market, successive governments have contributed to its artificial inflation by refusing to build on an epic scale new housing, which I think is the only way to bring down rampaging property prices. You just build more and more houses. You pile in on the supply because you can't really control demand. And that increase, you used to sit there, didn't you? And if you went to middle-class dinner parties, on the rare occasions that Mrs. O'Brien drags me to them, 10 years ago, you'd sit there and everyone would be comparing notes on how much their house had gone up in value. And it was a sort of high-five moment where you said, you know, last year I earned more from the house than I did from the job. And we thought that was great. Well, look where we are now. And that would be people who on paper are quite wealthy. Imagine what it would be like to be one of the 17 million who can't get their hands on 100 quid. It's 11:30. I'm not sure what question I'm asking you, but you know what topic we're discussing. If you want to talk to me before I put a simplistic question on this, I'd love you to ring in now. The number you need is 0345 6060 973. You are chronically broke, but other people would not believe it to either look at you or hear what you do. It's 11:31. You're listening to James O'Brien on LBC, addressing a subject I have a horrible feeling that we're going to return to again and again in the coming months. Economic insecurity has become the new normal in the UK, with at least 70% of the UK's working population chronically broke. It's a study by the think tank the Royal Society of the Arts. It spoke to 2,000 workers and found, and these are the two figures I find most fascinating and troubling, heartbreaking. 30% said that they were not managing to get by, and 40% said that their finances were permanently precarious. That's the working population. The working population. And I mentioned that I was at the Anne Frank Trust lunch yesterday where Lord Dobbs spoke, and the two twin subjects of his contributions really were the refugee crisis. He came over at 6 from Prague as part of Kinder Transport and is desperately trying to persuade the government to display similar compassion to new generations of refugees. But the second thing he spoke about, and you'd know a bit about this, wouldn't you, if you'd had to flee Nazi-occupied Prague, was the rise of the far right. And economics like this provide a petri dish in which the far right can really flourish. Because I sit here saying 70% of people in work are chronically broke, and that makes you so easy, potentially, to fall prey to the suggestion that the reason why you're broke is because there's too many of them. The reason why you're broke is because of her over there with the funny accent. The reason why you're broke is because of the unemployed people, or we can't afford to look after the disabled if the country's got no. But what about me? What about me? But don't look upstairs at the rich. It's very, very odd that this is unfolding when it's so clear to so many how old this particular playbook is. So 11:38 is the time. I would like you to tell me two things. What's it like? 0345 6060 973. And I hope I've got this right. I hope you're not finding this unpleasant or inappropriate. But I really want to speak to you. If you would put yourself in the category of having permanently precarious finances, but you've played by the rules, and to the outside world it looks like you're winning. 0345 6060 973 is the number that you need. The time is 11:38. You can email me, of course, james@lbc.co.uk. The best way to get in touch is tweets at Mr. James OB is the address that you need. The question is, it's a little bit intrusive, but of course we're never going to get a proper handle on this if people don't describe it. 70% of the UK's working population chronically broke, by which I guess it means if something really big or bad happened, you don't know how you'd cope. If you're not in this category, if you're lucky enough to be in the 30% who describe themselves as comfortable, feel free to contribute to the question, or answers to the question, of how do you think this has come about? How has this come about? 32% of workers have less than £500 in savings. 41% less than £1,000. It's everybody's skinned. Malcolm's in Hounslow. Malcolm, what would you like to say?
The things you said I fully identify with. People have got this idea that it's just the lower classes, or there is a lower class, that's harder, but it's not true. And I blame companies that are just not giving pay rises to their employees over years. I'm a senior manager at a major international airport. Haven't seen a pay rise for 6 years. And
the cost of everything else has gone up in that period, so you're worse off. You've had a pay cut in what they call real terms.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's not just me. All my colleagues are in exactly the same boat. It's not a me thing. It's a general abuse by employers to just not give pay rises to anybody really below senior management.
What, i.e. the people who make the decisions about who gets the pay rises get pay rises and nobody else does?
Well, I mean, it's a company policy, I would say, that they are just trying to make...
How do we know it was different 10 years ago? How do we know that 20 years ago you would have felt better off? Because
there wasn't so much outsourcing going on. We've got so many people coming into the country that are taking their wages. It's not just builders. It's everybody, including IT consultants.
So you've not been given a pay rise in your job because of immigration?
No, I'm not.
Just talk me through how that works. You're a senior consultant at one of the country's best-known airports. You've been in your job for many years. You haven't had a pay rise for 6 years, and your bosses have been able to do that because of immigration. How?
Let's not call it immigration. It's globalisation.
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 And that's what stops. So how come they can give themselves a pay rise but not you?
Well, you don't. An executive doesn't take a job unless he's guaranteed a good whack pay bonus.
So globalisation isn't the reason why pay rises aren't happening to you. The reason why pay rises aren't happening to you is your boss. But if he...
No, it's not that personal. It's a company policy.
Yes, but this is what I mean by the money. You say globalisation, and there'll be some truth in that. Although I don't quite see how supervising a British airport is going to. I mean, you're going to get more business the more global the world becomes. But it's a bit like the immigration word, mate. No offence, but as soon as you say the word globalisation, your boss is laughing all the way back to the bank. The reason why you haven't had a pay rise in 6 years is because of the decisions taken at the top of your company, and I bet the top of your company is doing fine.
Yeah.
So you start swallowing globalisation or immigration or whatever it might be, and you're doing their job for them, Malcolm.
Yeah.
Do you see that?
No, I'm not. I've explained to you what's going on.
Yes.
You can either believe it or not.
I do believe you. I completely believe you. But unless your company is making demonstrably less money than before, then the reason why you're not getting a pay rise is because they're taking the mickey out of you. It's not globalisation or immigration. It's company flipping policy, pal. You told me that yourself.
Yeah, you're right.
Oh, good. Well, let's next time start taking pot shots at the bosses rather than at the immigrants or the... Meaningless in this context, my friend. I apologise for my rudeness, but it's meaningless. It frustrates me so much just to come out with these buzzwords. Globalisation. It's not globalisation. And you know what the hardest bit of this is? The hardest bit of this is when I point out what you would need to do to have the power to demand more pay from your employer. Because trade unions, of course, are the handmaiden of Satan himself. It's 11:43. Wayne's in Dudley. Wayne, what's going on?
Well, I would say that I have been chronically broke.
What do you mean by that? Well, what would be your sort of experience or definition of it?
Well, when you say couldn't lay their hands on 100 quid, we would have many a time we couldn't lay our hands on 20 quid.
Crikey.
And I'm 46 years old in February.
God, we're exactly the same age. I was 46 on Saturday. And I mean, I can remember that, but I'd always have my mum and dad on the end. I'd never, ever not be able to get hold of something from somewhere.
No, we could always go but it wouldn't be yours, would it?
No, that's true.
The vicious circle, isn't it? You borrow it off your mum or your dad. Payday loans, for example.
You've done that?
What's happening there? Oh, God, yeah. God, yes. Every single week. You pay them back straight away at your wages, and guess what? You got nothing left, so you borrow again.
And you end up worse off the next month and worse off than... But oddly, even though I very much put myself in the 30% of comfortable people, I have had a very close family member get caught up in that mess. I had to actually bail them out. And at the end of the process, I'd moved from anger and fury to pure sympathy. It was so easy to get wrapped up in it and get caught up in it.
It is a vicious circle. All the time I was working, this was. Now... I had a sales job when I was young, and we was taught in a room. Job was an acronym for just over broke. And you know what? I hate that, and I honestly believe it. I honestly believe it because you go to work every day of your life, 12 hours a day on most occasions for me. I've seen my dad work all his life. He's 70 odd. He's still working.
Yeah.
You know, I've been brought up properly, and you're just living, even if you can call it that. We set up our own business 2.5 years ago because I was classed as unemployable due to arthritis.
Okay, how are you getting on?
I struggle on most days, but you know what? It doesn't matter anymore because I ain't got a boss. I'm working for myself. It's, you know, our business is taking off. It's doing well.
I'm glad. What are you doing, Wayne? What line are you in? What line are you in? Do you mind me asking?
Pet sitting, dog walking, pet boarding.
Have you got a website or anything like that?
It's just gone down at the minute.
All right. Well, give me a nod.
We have got a website.
Give me a nod next week when it's back up again, and I'll give it a shout out on the radio.
Oh, awesome, thank you. But we're doing quite well. It's just family because I won't employ anybody because it's a trust job. You know, you have to.
I hear you, and you're making your own cloth. Really, you're cutting your own cloth. It's not a path that would be open to a lot of other people, and it's not a path you would have gone down unless you sort of had to because of your illness. Briefly, because I'm late for the break. How do you think? Because if I had to hazard a guess at who would have described themselves as chronically broke, 2 years ago, I'd have gone for 20 to 25%. Then when I read that thing about 17 million people not being able to get their hands on 100 quid, I'd have got closer to 40, 45%. Today I read it's 70%. It's much, much worse than it was when we were kids. And we were kids at exactly the same time, actually, both born in 1972. It's definitely worse than it was then. Definitely and demonstrably in terms of inequality and comparisons. Obviously, in many other ways, we're a lot better off than we've ever been. How do you think the population has been persuaded to go along with this without complaining more?
Wages haven't gone up, have they?
No.
Everything's gone up.
We should notice that. Well, but your wages haven't gone up, but the cost of living's going up, and we're not doing anything about it.
But what can you do?
I don't know.
You say, look, we want more money, and they go, tough. What can you do?
Well, you can say, if you don't give us a pay rise, every single person on the shop floor is marching out at lunchtime, and he'll turn around and say, I think you'll find that Rupert Murdoch, Margaret Thatcher and their friends destroyed the trade union movement in this country, so you go back where you're going, and do you know what? I'm going to cut your wages just for you being cheeky and impertinent.
It's not even only that. When I worked in steelworks, they got people in with stopwatches to time the work you were doing to see if you got extra time to do extra work so they could lay people off.
Time and motion studies, which sounded so innocuous on the outside and which trade unions would once have resisted furiously. I'm not a flipping Red Robbo fan, and obviously, you know, the NUJ is a union that still has a modicum of power, but nothing like it had back in the day, and no one's going to pretend that unions haven't been part of the problem themselves in the past. But if I conduct this conversation uninterrupted for 100 years and hear stories like Wayne's and Malcolm's and all the other people waiting to talk to me, and they're all going to come down to that point of if there is money there in the business, more and more of it making its way out in dividends and making its way out in bonuses and enormous pay packages for CEOs and senior managers. So there's no argument to make suggesting the money's not there. So then you have to ask, why is none of that money here? And the answer is, you've got no power. And a lot of us voted to surrender the power that we would once have had. Of all the sort of apocalyptic scenarios for our future, I do find this one the most frightening. You go back to, you find Alan Greenspan, former head of the Federal Reserve in America, who suggested 6 or 7 years ago that the best way to solve declining workforce productivity is to lower the wages of the most productive parts of the workforce so that they'd have to work even harder to earn the same amount. He also said that if workers are more insecure, that's very healthy for the society, because if workers are insecure, they won't ask for wages, they won't go on strike, they won't call for benefits, they'll serve the masters gladly and passively, and that's optimal for corporations, which is kind of a bit like what Malcolm said, our first caller. Add to that how astonishingly proficient we've become in this country recently at punching ourselves in the face. Add to that kind of, how can they be poor, they've got a mobile phone type rhetoric, or the reason why 70% of the UK's working population is chronically broke is clearly because some of them were born elsewhere. That's why it's happening. It's all because of immigration. That's why I haven't had a pay rise. When I asked my boss for a pay rise, he said, no, you can't have a pay rise because of immigration. And I would have argued with him, but he drove off in his Porsche. But I agree with him, yeah. He's got 8 Porsches, but it's immigration why I can't have a pay rise. It's just such a powerful spell, isn't it, to cast over people. And the less they've got, the more susceptible they are to the spell's power. 70% of the population. So you look at median wages, that's going to be people earning figures that look from the outside to be lush. But from the inside, one tweet's just come in. Funny you should be talking about this, James. I worked out my finances last night, and this is from Davis, and I discovered that I earn £45 a month more than my outgoings. And any unexpected expenses, and I'm in trouble. And that's what this story's about. It's about unexpected expenses. You know, you can't actually get your job seekers allowance if you haven't got a phone. And most people are going to have a mobile phone, but it's like flat screen televisions, these little tabloid tactics. They just get so deep. They're like burrowing insects into the British bloodstream, aren't they? They burrow in. Oh, well, yeah. There's no such thing as poor people. They've got a flat screen television. 70% of the country now, chronically broke. You've got 32% of the UK's workers haven't got 500 quid in savings. But if they've got a phone, then they can't really be poor. You've been to the tip lately? You've been to the corporation tip? It's my mum's language, that. It's not called the corporation anymore, is it? The council tip. Go to the council tip, have a look at the tellies. There are flat-screen televisions there. You try and buy a television in Britain today that's not flat-screen. You'll have a job. But, you know, get the right wind behind you and the right tabloid sensibilities in front of you, and you'll somehow claim that no such thing. While actually being poor yourself, you're going to turn on other poor people and claim that the reason that there's poverty or the reason that there's discomfort, the reason that there's chronic brokenness is all to do with something other than the fact that the money is there, but it's not here. Oh, I've come over all kind of very British coup. Nathan's in Wokingham. Nathan, what do you think? I had two questions, really. What's it like? Or how have we let this happen?
Hi, James. I'm a big fan of yours, by the way, and you really opened my eyes in the last 3 months to listen to LBC. I think the biggest cause to it is it's the people at the top. They're selfish. It's not globalisation. It's not.
But they always have been. They always have been. And I'm not being rose-tinted, but I'm pretty sure that 20 years ago, even 10 years ago, it wasn't as bad as this.
But I find that people are more selfish, and the bigger the problem gets, the bigger that people get selfish. And it's not, it's not always everyone's fault, especially when you are struggling. You are going to be more, held back with your money. Of course you are. But the thing is, it's not the reason they can't give a pay rise. It's not because the company's not making money or anything like that. It's purely because they just don't want to.
You're not going to share unless you have to.
Exactly.
It's not a sign of evilness or viciousness, and because even people who like to think that they're quite altruistic, and I don't write a cheque voluntarily for the HM Revenue and Customs on top of what I owe them. So I'd go and have another couple of grand. I've had a good year. Nobody does that. So you're only going to pay what you're forced to pay, and you're only going to share what you're forced to share, unless you're, St. Francis of Assisi.
Yes, and. In my the business that I work, I run my own business, and the reason I started running my own business is because the line of work that I was in was only open to the people that could afford it, and I didn't think that was fair, and so I run my own business, and on top of that, I'm setting up a charity that falls and helps the people.
So you're a good man, and I admire you. And there'll be days when you're not good, and there'll be times where your lofty ambitions fail, and there'll be people who pretend not to understand that, and they'll claim that you're not really a good person unless you give everything you've ever earned to charity and invite 100 refugees to come and live in your front room. And they, of course, are the great facilitators of the injustice and the inequality. But that's what I can never quite understand, is how anyone can look at their own lot, be unhappy with how small it is, and decide to get cross with people who've got less. Is that just proximity? Do you think because I can find someone over the road, possibly they're Polish, possibly they're recently arrived, and I can see them, whereas I don't really see the kind of fellas that turn up at the President's Club dinner to drop 1,600 quid on a plate of food and the right, they believe, to stick their hand up a waitress's skirt. We don't... Is it just different worlds never meeting? Is that part of it?
I think it's people that you can blame the government, you can't put a face to it sometimes. They're not there in front of you, so you can blame the person that's come over from a different country because you can meet them, you can see them, so you can physically blame them, but you can't blame the government, the cuts, because you can, but
especially if you're right wing, you can't. If you're right wing, this is awful. This is like that line in Macbeth about it being harder to go back to where I was than it is just to carry on going ever deeper into the murk. It's because if you now say, crikey, I've been describing myself as right wing for 20 years, voting for all this stuff, and I've essentially voted to put a time bomb under my own backside, and that's historically that's when really scary stuff happens. Although I'm going to resist the urge to go down that road today. Thank you, Nathan. A lot of you are sending me this, so I'll just take Stephen's. My boss arrived at work in a brand new Lamborghini. I said, wow, that's an amazing car. He replied, if you work hard, put all your hours in and strive for excellence, then I'll get another one next year. And a few others as well have made similar points. The question, though, really, that we will continue with after the latest news is both the why and the how. The what and the how, actually. The what and the why. What's it like to have played by the rules, to have from the outside, you've done it right, and you have been persuaded over the years to hate on the people that you think have done it wrong, So how come you've ended up, quotes, chronically broke, end quotes? It's always a sort of pincer movement, isn't it? On the one hand, you've got immigration. That's why bosses aren't paying their workforce as much as the workforce deserves. And then on the other, you've got the public sector, because you can't really argue that the reason why teachers are being paid a pittance in relative terms is because of immigration. Same with sort of doctors and nurses as well. So that must just be because they're greedy and lazy and austerity or something, public sector. Then you've got people who have got a few quid who call out the unfairness of the current system, but you don't have to listen to them because they're champagne socialists. And then if you do buy into that rather attractive meme that we mentioned just before the news, that old joke about the boss arriving at work in a Lamborghini, and you admire it, and he replies, well, if you work really, really hard and hit all your targets and get all your bonuses this year, then next year I'll be able to buy another Lamborghini. That's the politics of envy, complaining about that. So we live in a society, this is one of my hobby horses, so apologies if you've heard it a gazillion times before, or indeed a carillion times before. We live in a society that has essentially, and this isn't true of other Northern European democracies, so you compare ourselves to similarly social and economic societies, it simply isn't true that dissent has been marginalised on an industrial scale. America possibly, I'm not fully au fait of the interplay between American media and politics, but you go to Scandinavia, go to France or Germany, and you're allowed to criticise in a way that just in this country you're not. You're just not allowed to criticise. Even a relative inconsequence, a relative non-entity like me gets a little bit of a reputation for sharing uncomfortable truths about Brexit, and you end up in the best-selling newspaper in the country. The sort of advertising money can't buy, but the audacity. I was talking to Gary Lineker about this earlier this week, oddly, and this just the audacity of actually challenging the way things are, and then these billionaire-owned media organisations just come down on you like a ton of bricks. So you can't criticise the fact that 70% of the country are chronically broke if you're not broke, because that would be champagne socialism. You can't criticise the fact that 70% of the working population are chronically broke if you are chronically broke, because that would be the politics of envy. You can't suggest that perhaps the reason why the workforce isn't getting enough money and the board are all sailing yachts over the horizon is because the board have got too much money, because that would be to deny the impact and the legitimate concerns regarding immigration. And if none of that works, then just say globalisation without really knowing what it means, and remove responsibility for what you get paid from the people who decide what you get paid. And we haven't even mentioned trade unions, which is where it all began. Someone cheer me up. Gaius is in Golders Green. Gaius, what would you like to say?
Hi there, James. Nice to talk to you. It's Caius, by the way.
I beg your pardon, Caius.
No, that's all right.
I nearly went for Keys, actually, because the college is spelt the same, and that would be pronounced Keys, wouldn't it?
It would indeed. It would indeed.
Or Gonville. I could have called you Gonville, just to be really sort of contrary. Yes, carry on.
I guess we would describe... I'm a 58-year-old freelancer working in the media.
Yes.
Have been freelance for about 25 odd years. I would describe our economic situation as just about, watching the pennies.
Yes.
Just about getting by each month, but no huge surplus at any point. It's always kind of, a wing and a prayer somewhat.
Yes.
But we are nevertheless comfortable.
Yes.
I would say.
Yes.
Now, the thing that interests me in all this debate is the issue of productivity in Britain.
Yes.
And by that, I don't mean people's ability to work hard. That's got nothing to do with it. It's the productive capacity of the economy at any given point. And Britain faces a unique situation, it would seem, in the Western economies, which is that really, since the end of the Second World War, its trend has been to become less productive. In Germany at the moment, they're having a debate. I mean, you wouldn't believe the credit this, but they're having a debate at the moment about how to spend their massive surplus.
Yes.
Should they spend it on further investment in the productive economy, or should they spend it on infrastructure, some of Germany's infrastructure is getting a bit old now and they need new railways, bridges, blah, 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 blah. That's not a debate we're having in this country.
No, and just it highlights the nonsense of the immigration argument as well, of course, because Germany's supposed to be sinking beneath the waves after Angela Merkel invited 1 million people into the country, and yet people in this country look at Germany's economy and I don't know, they probably just don't know the comparison?
Immigration, of course, is a necessary factor in an inefficient economy. So the measure of that would be that an inefficient economy would buy a new JCB digger.
Yeah.
Right? Inefficient one hires 12 blokes with 12 shovels.
Okay.
Right?
Well, that's 12
That's the measure of how you measure productive or unproductive. Now, I think one of the things that sort of got slightly missed in the Brexit debate, and by the way, I voted, Remain, is that membership of the EU allowed Britain to conveniently ignore its chronic underproductive nature. So, in other words, cheap labour was now freely available right from all corners of the EU, and it's allowed businesses, of course, to be the sort of band-aid operations that they have become, somewhat like the economy as a whole.
But then why Britain and not Germany?
Well, at the end of World War II, as you probably know, Marshall aid was available from the US to rebuild Germany. Some of it was also available to the UK, and Gordon Brown was the last chancellor to repay the final drabs of debt we
to
owed
the Americans. Yes, I remember.
Yes.
But I don't know what I mean is the flow of labour applies to every country in the European Union, and yet you're suggesting it impacts more heavily on the United Kingdom than it does on other countries.
What I'm saying is that the flow of labour is cheap labour has been historically more necessary here because we're a chronically underproductive.
Because we're not going to buy the JCB, so we are going to hire 12 people.
Exactly.
But if we hired the JCB, it wouldn't improve the wages of anybody in the workforce.
Yes, it would.
Would it?
Yes, because once you start investing in high-value technology in businesses, you're creating high-value jobs. So, for example,
but equally, if you had collective bargaining in the workplace,
that would, of course, yeah. I mean,
like Germany does.
Yeah, I mean, exactly. I mean, Thatcher was the beginning of the end for the British worker in terms of our ability to collectively bargain for higher wages. Once you say there's no such thing as society, then the rot begins at that point.
And in Germany, they do have...
every man for himself.
They have trade unionists on the board. Some of the things Jeremy Corbyn suggested in the right-wing media had paroxysms of horror and shock, are just normal in Germany and in some other northern European countries.
They're normal, and to some degree, the German economy has benefited from that harmonisation between management and labour. Obviously, that's not a view that many in the trade union left would agree with, because they kind of say our interests can never align.
So there's going to be blame on both sides for that kind of tribalism. Not tribalism, but you know what I mean.
Sure.
So how do we stop it then? What happens next? I mean, this could be the silver lining of Brexit, could it? That things are going to get so bad we're going to have to redraw our entire economic situation and become a lot more productive.
Well, I think there is possibly some truth in that, which is that this is D-Day.
But nobody voted for that. Nobody voted to get... So actually, I did have a weird exchange on Twitter with one of the kind of supposedly more sensible leavers who was suggesting that people will be able to sleep rough in order to improve their economic circumstances. People in the north on benefits will come to the areas where there are jobs, and they can sleep in doorways until they get themselves on their feet, and then they can... So you're saying things will get so bad that we'll have to change?
I think it's going to force the hand of UK PLC across the board to begin. They have to dig their way out of this, because once you start having chronic staff shortages, as of course the NHS is already having, once that trend widens, and it will, then businesses will just find themselves unable to function on the model that they have thus far been using.
This is the Brexit silver lining, ladies and gentlemen. Businesses will find themselves unable to function.
I think, James, the ultimately, and I've seen, actually, weirdly, I saw a news item just recently about asparagus farmers, I think it was in Norfolk, and the boss was saying, we've just bought this new kit.
Yes.
Which is going to do, the work of 10 people. It's cost us $500,000 to get it, but I've delayed buying this for the last 15 years because I have cheap Romanian workers doing it for me. So that's the point the country as a whole is at. So people's
this is the bit where you've lost me, and there's a lot of love coming in. Kias, there's a lot of love coming in for you. Will Guyatt,
James.
Caius. Our technology guru, Will Guyatt, has just tweeted, definitely my caller of the week, which is about as high as praise can get. But the one bit I don't get, and despite sometimes giving appearances to the contrary, I don't think I know everything. Why would him buying that machine be good news for people in Norfolk who are currently underpaid? I can see. I mean, it's obviously bad.
No, it's for people who might have wanted to work on an asparagus farm and get reasonable wages. Forget it. That's not going to happen.
No, this is what I was getting. Yes.
James, historically, capitalism works on the idea of the creative destruction. Okay, the analogy is gardening. Every year you prune the garden, you till the soil, you sow new seeds, and by harvest time you've got more stuff. But when it comes to the spring or whenever you start pruning it, you have to viciously prune in order to get the best growth out of those plants the following year.
Right.
An economy is pretty much the same model, that you have to periodically destroy your profit earning potential. Sorry, you have to periodically destroy in order to create.
Yeah. Is this a bit like disaster capitalism, but from a slightly more?
No, it's much more the idea. Well, the steel industry would be a good case in point. The idea of clinging to industries that have passed their sell-by date, instead of those workers being redeployed, retrained, and reanimated. Britain has some stupendous technological possibilities in the future.
Yes.
The graphene phenomenon would be one of them.
We discovered it, didn't we?
We did indeed, and the government actually has bizarrely invested in it.
Although the bloke that discovered it has suggested that Brexit would make a repetition of that very, very likely.
Yeah, well, there you go.
Well, this is scary then. So this is why the 30% are even luckier than they already realise, because if things are going to get considerably worse before they get better,
yes, I think that's true.
Who's going to get hit hardest? The poor.
The poor, of course. Yeah, the poor, of course, will get hit hardest. And for all the middle classes who've been banking for years on their houses being worth £12 trillion, and darling, when I cash it in, I've got my feet up in the Algarve. Well, you've still got to cash it in and still got to find someone to buy it off you. And these are, in the end, just houses. They're not productive.
This was a penny drop moment for me a few years ago when we were having one of those ludicrous middle-class conversations about property prices, and a slightly wiser, older fella said, yeah, but it's still only worth one house.
Yeah.
It's still, and it's still, I get that, and I don't get it at the same time. It's still only worth one house. It doesn't matter how much it's worth, really, if you then have to house yourself afterwards in the market that's inflated so much that the house you're currently in is worth what appears to be a fortune.
Precisely.
Caius, what a pleasure.
Unbelievable pleasure too, sir.
Thank you. We must do it again. 12:70. Coming in for Caius, whose description of Britain's productivity problem as a root cause of our financial problems was, well, as impressive as it was chilling. The notion that, obviously, the acceleration of any decline in our national standing that Brexit will bring about is argued, and I've actually heard this in different contexts. The argument that what Brexit will do is make things so bad economically that we have to rebuild from the ground up, almost sort of a 1945 style scenario, except, of course, it would be entirely self-inflicted. This from Snoopy, not the original. No wonder the Tory media hate my favourite Liberal at Mr James O.B. so much. My head just popped during the last call to his programme. 22 after 12. I don't get it. I just don't get it. I get bits of it, and I hate other bits of it, and I have sympathy sometimes when people end up doing really, really stupid things, where encourage the amount of money that's put into encouraging us to vote against our own interests is incredible. Look at tabloid culture. 70% of the country now think that they're chronically broke, but we've allowed a climate to grow up around us in which no one's allowed to criticise that. No one's allowed to criticise it. I mean, thankfully, we're beyond the days where anyone would say there's no such thing as poverty, you've got electricity and inside toilets. But I think we might be. I could imagine Jacob Rees-Mogg claiming there's no such thing as poverty because there's no children running around barefoot anymore. And you can't criticise it, because if you criticise it and you've got money, you're a champagne socialist, which is a fairly hollow pejorative, but it is spat at people with venom. And if you are skint, if you've suffered and you're criticising it, unless you're blaming the wrong things, immigration, globalisation, unless you're blaming the wrong things, then it's the politics of envy. So if you've not got enough and you're blaming the people who've got far too much, that's the politics of envy. If you've not got enough and you're blaming immigrants, that's fine. You carry on. And who makes that decision? Yeah, people with far too much. It's really simple. But again, I say that, I've been banging this drum for the best part of a decade, and some people still aren't dancing to my tune. Noah is in Peterborough. Noah, what would you like to say?
Hi, James. Thanks for having me on, although I'm not sure how I'm going to follow your previous caller.
Yeah, I always get a bit uncomfortable when callers get too much love. My ego is such that I'm prepared to accommodate a degree of love. But when I start suspecting that listeners are more impressed by the caller than by me, I find my ego curdles slightly. But I think I might have to suck it up today, Noah. What do you want to say? You'll be fine.
Well, just listening to your description of the chronically broke, I sort of realised that really does describe my situation. In 2012, I graduated with a master's degree, and I suddenly realised that from that time to this, I've only ever had temp jobs and 0 hours contract.
Right.
And
it's not what you signed up for, is it? When you started?
Definitely not. Right. Yeah, it is enough to make me occasionally think, why did I bother? But just the instability that provides, it's very embarrassing because I'm 26 and I'm still unable to move out of my mum's house. And I just think that having that instability is such a horrible factor in this whole debate, because you can't count on your working hours, and you can be let go at any time, fundamentally for any reason, effective immediately. It's almost impossible to sort of plan on anything other than a month by month or even a week by week basis.
Which is great for a certain class of employer, because it means that you will pretty much, when they say jump, you'll have little choice but to ask how high.
Yes, exactly. And I'm currently in the process of trying to find more permanent work, and the amount of job adverts that I've seen which specify that the successful candidate will be loyal is quite astonishing. Just almost every job advert says, the successful candidate will be loyal, and then you scroll down and it says, oh, it's 0 hours and it's £7.20 an hour or something.
Yes, and this is what I always struggle slightly with class things, because we're so much the children of our own environments and our own backgrounds on that more than anything else. But you were clearly middle class. The degree would define you as such in most parameters. It sounds a little bit patronising, maybe, but this was never supposed to happen to people like you. We could accept that it was always going to happen to someone, and then we could, according to our politics, decide how much help they needed. But we're now reaching a point where it's almost too big a problem for it to become a political priority to provide help.
Sure. I mean, I would argue slightly with the middle class definition.
Everyone does argue with that. And nobody's middle class, and yet, I mean, on paper, everybody is pretty much. But I hear you. I know what you mean.
Well, that's another interesting point. Somehow, in the last sort of 10 or 15 years, we've moved from a situation where we're all middle class now to we're all technically self-employed now.
Oh, that's true. Yes, you can be
because of course you can. But I've had jobs where I'm an independent. I'm classed as an independent.
Yeah, you mean in terms of protections? So you might, So where once this frightens me a little bit as well, because you have no. Obviously no protections in terms of trade unions, but you don't even have the most basic of protections. You saw this with the Carillion collapse. If something happens, you just get hung out to dry because you're ostensibly self-employed, and yet by most understandings of the word, you are employed at the same time. It's only the rights that have gone, isn't it?
Oh, exactly. Yeah, exactly. And by any reasonable definition, I would be an employee in the sense that, I work for, I work for somebody else. But under the legal definition, I am self-employed, which also means I have to do my own taxes, which, is a minor point, but still slightly annoying.
And who speaks for you politically?
Well, I'm a member of the Labour Party.
Yeah, I mean, that's the way things are going to go. But my problem is that Jeremy Corbyn represents people who feel it doesn't have to be this way. I'm not yet persuaded what he's going to replace it with, but I guess the more that feeling grows, that it doesn't have to be this way. And you can see touches of Trump and Brexit in this as well. Don't really care what happens afterwards. I just know that I don't want things to carry on like this. And that then would sort of be the meeting of all political strands on one optimistic call for change. Noah, thank you. It's just gone 12:30. I don't know where the day's gone, but I was going to do something funny for the last half an hour. Can you think of anything funny, Noah, that we can do for the last half an hour, or otherwise I'm going to carry on with this?
Oh, bring back Mystery Hour. That'd be brilliant.
I can't do Mystery Hour on a Friday. Get behind me, Satan. Honestly, what the hell is this? It is 12:29, and you are listening to James O'Brien on LBC. Now, I've never met Noah before, but he sounded to me like a very well-educated, articulate, thoughtful guy. The kind of people who weren't ever supposed to fall into these kind of economic holes. I want to live in a world where nobody does. But if it is to be inevitable that people fall into economic holes, people at the bottom of the pile struggle the most, then I also want to live in a society where they get helped. And yet this points to 32% of the people in this country in work today have got less than £500 in savings. And this could never have been brought about unless a massive majority of them had been successfully groomed to believe that it's all an upshot of European Union membership or immigration or, I don't know, champagne socialism or whatever it may be. And then suddenly, for everyone eventually, reality will bite. And reality will explain, if you will, that the reason why you've not had a pay rise for 6 years is because your boss hasn't had to give you one. And I don't care how many people have come from Poland or from Romania or from Timbuktu, until he has to, unless you're really lucky or unless you're brilliant and other people want to hire you and they're so keen to keep you they will pay you more, unless you're in one of those two categories. And a lot of people are lucky. There are a lot of very good bosses. But if you're not lucky, and you're not lucky enough to be brilliant, you're never going to get it. And you're going to carry on blaming all the wrong people and all the wrong reasons. Until it's 80% of the population that is chronically broke. Until it's 60% of the population that hasn't got £500 in savings. It's 12:31, where we contemplate the grim tidings from the Royal Society of Arts, suggesting that economic insecurity has become the new normal. No one's disputing it. I don't think anybody is. If we need to provide a dispute, then it would be something along the lines of, oh yeah, I've seen them, these poor people, they've got phones and shoes, they can't be that poor. Or I bet they go on holiday and they probably eat pizza. Okay, so I mean, the fact that you haven't got 500 quid's worth of savings might be because you spent all your money on beluga caviar, or indeed Hawaiian pizzas. But the general trend here is actually pretty much unchallengeable. Although the fact that people want to challenge it is the best illustration going of how successful the right-wing media has been in this country. Because even to go back to Caius, that brilliant caller at the top of the hour, explaining the relationship between productivity and the wages and apparent economic poor performance, even that, of course, has its roots in the 1980s, because in the 1980s, the amount of money that a company made that was reinvested in so-called R&D, research and development, was a much greater proportion of the profits than it is now. They've swapped them round. So when, and I can't off the top of my head give you the numbers, but I presume they're quite easy to find. The amount of money that the average FTSE 100 company would put into R&D compared to dividends, compared to actually taking it out of the company, has swapped. So say it was 70% would go into R&D, 30% would come out in profit. And now it would be the other way around. 70%, 80% of it would come out in money making its way into the pockets of people, whether they work for the company or not. And 20 to 30% being reinvested in making the company more productive. So if you're confused as to how productivity could have been allowed to wither in this way, the answer is pretty simple. The people in charge of the withering of productivity were the ones that were taking the money home with them instead of investing it in new equipment, or to use Caius's example, a JCB. And how could they get away with that? Well, partly, actually, for once, it would seem that cheap labour has played a part in that process, but not caused it. That, of course, is the difference between somebody using immigration as a scapegoat and somebody using it as a reality. It's 12:38. I still can't quite imagine what it would be like to be 26 instead of 46 from my background. No real money there. No inheritance to speak of. Please God, I don't inherit what I'll get when my mum passes away for many, 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 many years to come. Dad didn't leave. Well, I don't want to be indiscreet, but didn't need probate. It's probably the nicest way of putting it. And that's normal, isn't it, for families these days? What would you do if you were 26 now? I don't know, actually. Chris is in Richmond. Chris, what would you like to say?
James, I guess I want to talk about the savings issue. I mean, I had a mental health problem, 4 years ago, and I ended up in the Priory for a week. I spent $4,000 of my own money.
Oh, Lord.
And after that experience, I thought, oh, my God, there's lots of people in this country that haven't even got £100 in savings.
Yes.
Now, I was back at work within a week, James. I was very lucky.
Yes.
But what about those people that haven't got the money, that spent months and months on waiting lists and might get a talking therapy?
If they're lucky.
What do you do?
This was 2 years ago. We took a call
No,
from
4 years ago.
No. I'm saying 2 years ago, someone told me that in some South London boroughs for CALMS, for the child and young adult mental health services, the waiting list was 13 months.
Well, exactly. I mean, if you're a parent having to manage that, it's extremely difficult. But if you're just someone that's just fallen on hard times, I mean, I think it's the biggest cause of workplace absence in this country. And that's why I'm more in I call myself an evangelist now. I've written about it for the Independent, for other publications.
Good.
I'm doing a talk about it in a couple of weeks because I just feel even local authorities aren't doing enough to help people.
Well, they would say they can't, wouldn't they? They would say that the cuts from central government have to be made somewhere, and despite Theresa May uttering words to the contrary, these cuts have been imposed by Whitehall on local councils, and mental health services have been one of the areas to suffer.
Well, I mean that
And
is
adult.
partly true. That is partly true, but I can give you a couple. I mean, I live in Richmond, and I'm quite involved in local politics, and I've seen some things that the Conservatives have done. I mean, they've wasted money on school building projects. They spent £2.5 million on an overbuild, a build that overran. And they've made other mistakes on local kind of capital projects, but at the same time, they've taken away basic things like school uniform grants. They're now charging, James, over £100 a month, so people are temporarily homeless to store their possessions.
Is that
They've
true?
got minimum. Yeah, absolutely true.
Well, I mean, I'm not going to defend any of this, but neither am I going to say that it necessarily addresses the question of how 70% of the UK's working population has ended up chronically broke.
No, but I guess the point is that the people aren't, even when they need that support, aren't getting it. For example, local councils have an ability to provide full discretion, as in 100% relief on council tax. Now, some London boroughs, for example, Kensington and Chelsea provide 100%. Richmond require everyone to pay a minimum of 15%. And Citizens Advice wrote a fantastic report which was discussed at a council meeting a couple of months ago, and they talked about a mother, for example, lost her husband. 3 kids, husband had been looked after by her for 3 or 4 years.
Yes.
And she said, I need council tax relief, and the council flatly refused. So that's why there are people, as you talked about, who are genuinely falling
And we don't hear about that because you can't blame it on immigration.
Exactly.
I got a message off Don, 23 years paying tax, had a heart attack last year, got 1 year's worth of ESA, and it was no immigrant that made that decision.
Well, exactly. I mean, I saw Zach Goldsmith a few months ago during the Richmond Park by-election. I said, Zach, have you watched Daniel Blake? And he sort of kind of rolled his eyes and said, no, I'll look at it in my spare time. Because, unfortunately, a lot of MPs don't have...
He's too busy watching Bollywood films.
Well, exactly, mate. You're absolutely right.
If I recall.
Right.
And you're right. I shouldn't be looking for simple answers to this. I'm breaking one of my own golden rules. The answers are going to be multifarious and complicated, but there might be a kind of lever to get into them with simpler conclusions. But Chris reminds us that that's probably a bit of a futile exercise. 0345 6060 973 1242 is the time. As I bid farewell to Chris, it frees up a phone line for you, so don't text me complaining that you can't get through. Be quick. Use your finger wisely. Pete's in Bristol. Pete, what's going on?
Hello, mate.
Hello.
I've been learning quite a bit about a word that's thrown around a lot, but I never really understood it much until recently, which is neoliberalism.
Oh, good. Thank you. Yes, we need you. Pull up a seat, Pete.
I'm walking the dog, so I don't think they'll appreciate that.
Okay,
but,
carry on.
I'll definitely chat. So neoliberalism was something that was sort of brought in mainly by the Thatcher government and continued by Labour New Labour, because it's something that brings together the sort of the left ideology of left and right ideologies of individualism. So it's sort of it's about getting financial liberalism, and it's about being able to work for yourself and earn your own money.
That's the mantra of self-responsibility. Don't rely on anything or anyone, and this, which works great if you're at one end of the economy, but it's rather hard to see the benefits of it if you're at the other.
Yeah, but it also plays into the sort of human psyche of, they've developed our psyches in a certain way, I'd argue, but obviously you're more optimistic than I am. I'm a bit of a pessimist. But, you know, the papers working with the government have developed this, so there's a sort of...
if you're not well off, it's your fault.
Deserving poor.
Yes, exactly that. And if it's not your fault, it's because of immigration. It's never the fault of the government, the system, or the politicians, ever.
No. And quite interestingly, I mean, I think you were talking before about how the US fits into this, and also your fantastic caller talked about German productivity. And in a way, we are sort of economically, politically, and geographically in the middle of those two, which gives me a bit of hope that we can still
steer a course more towards Germany than towards America, because you mean apart from an opioid crisis and half the country living in trailers, we do seem to be heading rather closer to that position than we do to the prosperity of a country like Germany, while of course being simultaneously told that coming out of the European Union is going to make us better off. And it is, not for the first time, one of those topics that makes you wish you were studying it from a perspective of 20 years hence, rather than actually having to live smack in the middle of it. Brexit is unlikely to improve a situation in which 70% of our working population describe themselves as chronically broke, and yet you'd have to be nuts not to recognise that Brexit is largely a result of the fact that 70% of the working population describe themselves as chronically broke. If you cast a system as being the reason why things are as they are, then you can't really blame people who feel that they've got the dirty end of the stick for voting to break that system or to change that system. Of course, the great triumph of the billionaires who bankrolled Brexit was to persuade people who were already economically oppressed that their situation would improve as a result of casting their vote in the way that the shady billionaires wanted them to. Unfortunately, they've done the opposite. But I don't blame them for that. I guess the skintier you were, the easier it would be to persuade you that voting just to change stuff would be a good idea. What's weird is that I think a similar impulse will probably propel Jeremy Corbyn into Downing Street unless something very significant happens in the next couple of years. And by that, I mean something like the invasion of the Falkland Islands, which completely turned the polls on their head. Last time it looked as if this country might have been about to elect a properly left-wing government. I'm not a properly left-wing person. It's a mark of how mad politics in this country has become that you can portray someone like me as such. I never shut up about the public school that I attended or the pride I take in the fact that my dad sent me there. We haven't done grammar schools as a topic today, despite the fact that they're in the news, because we've done them so many times before, and you know my views, and the people who are normally cheering along with me on other issues get very, very cross with me on education-related issues. I can't help who I am and what I believe, but the notion that suggesting if you've got 100 people working for a company and 99 of them are on 20 grand and one of them is on 200 million, the suggestion that you could just redistribute it slightly does not a communist make, or even a lefty. But look what the media's done to us now. Look what it's done to you, actually. Turned you into somebody who thinks that anybody suggesting the boss gets paid too much and you get paid too little is some sort of Marxist. Danny's in Borehamwood. Danny, what would you like to say?
James, I'm sure it's a multifaceted answer and there's loads of aspects to it, but from a psychological perspective, I think at its core, the same thing here is what's been going on throughout all of human history and cultures and economic systems, which is that people are more likely to make decisions that benefit themselves than others.
Yes.
So if you're in control of who gets paid what, not only are you more likely to raise your own salary than your workers, but the two can be in conflict. So
Which
raising your workers' salary
despise trade
reduce
unions.
the amount that you can. And people who are typically in control of businesses today will look back, being a certain age, and remember the power of the unions resulting in a 3-day week, which gave rise to Thatcher. And it's quite like a pendulum. The more it swings one way, the more it's going to swing the other way.
When's it going to start swinging back?
I don't... Well, 2022.
You think that's your prediction for the next general election, is it?
Yeah.
Well, I mean, it swung a bit, didn't it, last time, much to the shock of the so-called professional observers of politics. But And I think you're probably right. I just said something similar myself. But for me, it's just a little bit Brexity. It's the idea that the Corbyn appeal is that things don't have to be like this, but the flesh on the bones of what they're going to be like instead is still a little bit thin.
I am very sceptical of both ends of the spectrum, and I think when you get too much power in the hands of a few people, either at the head of a very centralised government or capital, you get a lot of problems.
Yes, yeah, and that would involve a sort of form of economic devolution then. I don't know. You have conversations like this, and we don't do it very often because it leaves us feeling like we're feeling now, which is that we're on the brink of something quite huge and bad, but we're not entirely sure what it is or when it's going to happen.
I couldn't echo it better.
It's a good job you did, though. I thought you'd been cut off. 12:54 is the time. You're listening to James O'Brien on LBC. Just with reference to that story that hopefully we won't talk about again next week, but which we've talked about an awful lot this week, that so-called President's Club dinner at the Dorchester. One tweet came in that actually, and I suspect unintentionally, gave me a much better understanding of the position that I have struggled to understand this week. And it's kind of the sense that there's a sense of anger towards women, or a sense of blame directed at women. The notion that that women somehow should be responsible. We put out a clip, actually. That this female caller said women must take responsibility for what happened at the President's Club dinner. And the parallel I used most obviously was with sort of rampant sex offending at that New Year's Eve market in Cologne a couple of years ago. Nobody would have said, well, you know, if it had happened the following year, would anybody have turned around and said, oh, well, you know, women got molested last year, why would they go again this year? They've got to take some responsibility for their actions. And the steam is still coming out of the ears of some people who are pretending not to understand the pure simplicity of that observation. But this on Twitter, and it's perhaps inevitably, it's one of those weird anonymous accounts. But this is a reply to that point about how can you ask women to take responsibility for being molested? And it says here, apparently women never have power over men, apparently. That's what it's always about. This is what men like me find almost impossible to understand, is that because historically and usually men are only able to have sex when women want to, some men hate them for it. So that's what he means, isn't it? Apparently women never have power over men, apparently. It's not power, mate. It's just an exercise of free choice. Don't feel emasculated. Don't feel small. Don't feel inadequate. And don't hate women, because that leads you to a place where you start trying to blame them for getting raped. Jill's in Beckenham. Jill, what would you like to say?
I'd like to say that I think it's all a big conspiracy. The government is in thrall to big business. Yes. First of all, you destroy the unions or cripple the unions, and then you make people very insecure in their employment by putting them on 0 hours contracts, so they don't feel able to protest. And then you can push the wages down as far as you like. Big business makes lots of money. The government gets supported by big business, you know, contributing to Tory funds. Yep. And bankrolling
Brexit.
Sorry?
Bankrolling Brexit as well, you could argue, although big business mostly is opposed to Brexit. It's just a few shady billionaires that want it to happen.
Yeah, so I think it's all deliberate.
Well, I can see why. I'm a bit more perhaps naive than you. I sort of prefer to think that it's a curious combination of coincidence and circumstance with a small slice of conspiracy.
I'm a very, very old lady, and I have children and grandchildren, and I fear for what sort of a world we're leaving for them. I don't see any real hope for the future at all.
And you join the dots together in a rather bleak way for the end of our week together, Jill, but you can't be blamed for not speaking as you find. It's coming up to 12:58. I wonder if Ahmed in Walthamstow will leave us with a slightly cheerier aftertaste to this afternoon's programme. Come on, Chuckles.
Good morning, and I'm really sorry, but I won't.
Go on, Ben.
I'm really sorry. James, you know, I think we're already in a 3-day week because of the zero contract hours. And the caller before me, what a fantastic call. She alluded to that as well. I grew up at a time when I experienced the 3-day week, and I honestly feel that the zero contract hours has brought about a 3-day week for a lot of people.
But it's a relatively small proportion of the working population on zero-hour contracts, as far as I can tell.
Yeah, I'm not exactly sure of the numbers, but I can only talk about some of the impacts. And
that's not going to imply... I mean, what I'm more interested in is somebody near 70% of the population think that they're chronically broke. I'm interested in the wealthiest of them and how they've ended up in the situation that they're in. And that's unlikely to be 0 hours contract, but it is going to be linked to insecurity, isn't it? And inability to negotiate pay rises.
I think that's part of it. The other part of this is if you look at the sort of the cost of getting around, getting to work and living, council tax, travel expenses and all that sort of stuff, it's all gone through the roof, and it is really, really hard for a person to find a job where they can save and live and feel like they are living.
And that is why they have to, because I've often wondered whether it's a commercial decision, an editorial policy, or something rather more sinister than that, when right-wing newspapers and right-wing journalists pile in to point over there and get the population to blame all of the wrong reasons for their current situation. I think some people in my business do it for fun and giggles. I really do. But I think the people at the very top, the string pullers, the newspaper owners and a couple of sociopathic editors are doing it on purpose. I really do. I wonder if I still will on Monday.